If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Hikers, campers, outdoorsmen, etc. What was the scariest thing you've ever seen while in the deep woods? Deep in the backcountry of Montana, my mom was hiking up a mountain to get to a crystal dig site. She got separated from her group near the end of the trail and was the first to reach the top of the mountain. As she stood on the trail, she saw what she described as a 4-foot by 6-foot black piece of silk whipping through the trees, hovering about 8 feet off the ground. She was startled but not afraid, as she sensed that the thing was aware of her presence and was fleeing from her as quickly as it could. She said it moved like the Ewoks moving through the trees in Star Wars. This occurred in 2017, and ever since, my mom has posted countless places online asking, "Has anyone else ever seen this black silk thing in the woods?" And for years, no one ever had. Recently, however, a group that studies this sort of thing reached out to her and asked for more details and informed her that this appears to be a new phenomenon, but sightings have been on the rise. About a month ago, my friends had a great idea to explore the forest near one of their homes. It is about 1 a.m., and we discovered that the flashlights we had didn't work other than these not so bright lights on the side of the flashlights, but we went exploring anyway. We ended up going through a really dark path, which led to a field, then to a hill, and finally the path that went into the forest, which was a bit steep. While going in, I get a bit behind the rest, thanks to not being able to see and stepping right into a big hole along the path. By this point, I just turn around and leave with a, not so bright, light in my hand. I thought it would be pretty funny if they thought I had suddenly disappeared, and frankly, I'm not a fan of exploring creepy forests at 1 a.m. I didn't think about how scary it would be to walk alone up the path, down the hill, through the field, and, worst of all, through a really dark path. I was breathing so heavily when I got to my friend's house and just sat on his porch, constantly looking around, making sure nothing just jumped out at me. A few years ago, I was elk hunting miles out in the Colorado backcountry. There are no trails around here, let alone people. Through the woods, I hear a deep, low-pitched droning sound that can't possibly be natural. My hairs raise up, but I'm holding A.3206, so whatever, I'll check it out. I follow the sound, and it takes me to the top of a ridge. I discover an old, dead, twisted pine tree that has been hollowed out from decomposition, and the wind is blowing across it just right, so it's playing like an organ pipe. I'm standing there silently, marveling at this tree, and I kid you not, a 6x6 bull elk walks right below me, 20 yards away, with no idea I'm there. It's as if the tree has called me in. I've been back to that tree 4 times since, each time with wind on the ridge and no sound from the musical tree. Not my story, but my friend's. He took his 7-8-year-old son fishing with him up in the mountains. They first try a couple of regular spots by the stream. After a few hours with no bites, they go deeper down, following the stream. It's at this point that his son starts saying, "Dad, look, there's another guy here too." Obviously, my friend sees nobody, says it's nothing, and they keep fishing. After settling on a new spot, he notices his son acting really strange. Kind of nervous, scared, and almost hiding a bit. He asks his son again what's wrong, to which the response is, "The man is hanging over there by that tree." There's nothing there, but of course, after hearing that, they both jetted out of there. He hasn't gone back to that area since. I used to do abandoned suburban exploration, areas that were nice neighborhoods but were often left abandoned to nature, and well, it looks kind of like Fallout. So we were exploring this abandoned town, and there was an abandoned mortuary. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the weight of it? The mood changed the moment we walked into the mortuary. It went from, "Oh, this is interesting," to cold sweat terror. I swear everything was so much louder and all my instincts said, "Get the duck out." I never had that feeling before, but I felt it then, and since I didn't feel like becoming the main character in a horror movie, I ducked and left. Hiking 6 miles up to a campsite in the Appalachians only to get there, and it's closed with a sign that says campground closed due to aggressive bear activity. It was about 8 p.m., and the sun had just started to dip below the horizon. I decided not to stay on the mountain, so I walked back down in pitch black darkness with aggressive bear on my mind and only a tiny Rayovac flashlight that produced a light large enough to illuminate a 4-foot circle on the ground. I began to hear voices, and I frequently saw red eyes between trees. I had a constant feeling of being watched and followed. At one point, my mind played tricks on me, probably from exhaustion, and the trail looked like it ended in a wall. It turns out the trail was just bending at a sharp angle. Then I thought I saw a woman in white ahead of me. I decided to keep my flashlight fixed to the ground after that. My encounter in the Red River Gorge, I've gone there countless times for almost 30 years now, and one time I had the scariest experience of my life, and I look at nighttime a little different there now. What I saw was not human at all, but a big part of me believes it could look human if it wanted to. And I felt like it could have ripped me in half. Me and my husband both saw it, along with a friend I had at the time. We only saw that creature once, but multiple other times we saw what we named pod people, and they're just people who aren't all there. They seem off in a way or don't respond normally to things. When you talk to these guys, how did they respond? Did they ever acknowledge hearing anything, and were you looking at them and hearing it at the same time? Trying to guess if they were ignoring it or trying to possibly make you think you never heard it? Did the two take off running without saying anything? Just turn and run? I still think maybe they were on the lookout for something, but I feel if it were just another human, they'd be closer to it. The distance they kept is weird. This is a story my aunt told me years ago. My aunt and her family lived in a very rural and backwoods area of Lincoln County, West Virginia. She said that her father would go fox hunting periodically. He and other men would travel up into the mountains to their camp. There they would let their dogs run, chase foxes, and spend the evening talking and telling stories among themselves. My aunt had many siblings, which was not uncommon back in the 1950s in the backwoods of WV. Her mother decided that she would walk with several of the younger children up to her husband's, my aunt's father's, camp. My aunt was at the party. She said that they walked a long way back up onto the mountain and spent a few hours relaxing and spending time with her dad. The group had such a nice time that they didn't realize that it had gotten late. My aunt's father gave his wife a lantern in order for her and the kids to be able to see on their long journey down the mountain. As the group left, the light from the fox hunters' camp eventually faded out of sight. As they walked down the mountain, her mother noticed a small ball of light about the size of a softball coming down the mountain behind them. Thinking it was her husband needing something, she and the children stopped on the trail to wait. As they stood there, the light slowly made its way down the path and into better view. My aunt said that the closer it got, the more they could see that it wasn't a lantern but a ball of light floating about 3 feet from the ground. She said that once her mother realized this, she put the children in front of her and told them to run as fast as they could down the old trail that was cut into the mountain. My aunt told me that they all ran as fast as they could down the hill. She said that the faster they ran, the faster the ball of light moved. My aunt said that they finally got to where their home was and ran inside and locked the door. According to my aunt, they were all terrified. When they finally got the courage to look out the window, they saw nothing. My creepy hiking experience. So this was a 2-night and 3-day trip in New Zealand doing the Holdsworth to Cadoc track in the Tararua State Forest Park. After hiking for roughly 4 hours, I arrived at Totara Flats Hut for the night at around 4:15 p.m. Fast forward to 10 p.m. I have just had dinner and lie down in my sleeping bag drifting off to sleep to the sound of the river as I had my bed set up next to the window that I like to keep open during the night for the fresh Tararua air. Anyway, I woke up at around 0130 to footsteps on the veranda. I was a little confused as you would normally expect to see some sort of flashlight if it was a human, but there was nothing but footsteps. I decided not to peek out the window as I thought that it may just have been some moonlight hikers coming in from Holdsworth. The footsteps stopped after about 10 to 15 seconds of steady thudding which were getting louder and louder. I was expecting to hear the door creak open, but that did not happen. I poked my head out the window and there was no one and nothing there. I passed it off as a possum, similar to a cat but much bigger and sleep in the trees, or a pig. About 1 to 2 minutes had passed since the footsteps stopped. They began again. I grabbed my flashlight, which was right next to me, and pointed it out the open window. I anxiously looked around. Of course, nothing was there, and the footsteps had stopped as soon as I put my head out. This continued to happen another 3 times, at random intervals during the night. 4 a.m. came along. I hadn't heard the thuds anymore for a while, but now there were scratching noises on the windows, not like trees brushing against them but actual scratches like a cat does on a closed door. This creeped me out a bit, so I got all my gear and moved into the other room, where you could actually shut the door. The scratching went on for a good 30 seconds, then stopped. I was waiting and waiting for someone or something to come through the door or the window, but after about an hour of not hearing anything, I eventually fell back asleep. Waking up at around 8 a.m., I quickly had breakfast, wrote about my experience in the log book, and began the next 5-6 hour leg of my adventure to Tutiwai Hut. The weird thing is that in December 2013, I did the same trip again. This time I took my mom along with me, got to Totara Flats Hut, and was eager to see if anyone had seen my log of the previous trip. Sure enough, 2 nights after I left, another couple of hikers stayed at Tutiwai Hut and replied to my log. They had also experienced the same thing during the night, and they could not figure out what it was either and stated that we were scared shitless. I have not been back there since 2013. I went camping with my partner at the time in Urwera a few summers ago. I was apprehensive about entering that particular area, as I had heard stories through my whānau about the Urweras and their history, but my partner assured me he was Tangata Whenua and knew his way around the area well. We found a clearing near a river and slept outside by the fire, which was quite magical. It was the morning I woke just as dawn was breaking, and I just had that eerie sense I was being watched. I sat up and crossed the river, and through a thin veil of mist, I was shocked to see a Maori man standing right there staring at us. Then I noticed he held a te'a, which he raised and pointed at me. In that moment, I had this overwhelming sense that I simply wasn't in the right place and needed to leave. I quickly turned to wake up my partner and tell him someone was across the river watching us. He sat up, and as I turned to point to the man, he had disappeared. The tree line was a good 20 meters away from the river edge where the man had been standing, so there was simply no way the man could have disappeared within the 2 to 3 seconds I turned my head for. Well and truly spooked, I told my partner I wanted to leave, and that was that, but I do still think about it from time to time as the only near paranormal experience I've ever had. I was walking up Kakepaku Mountain, which I had done a few times before. It was very early on a summer weekday morning, maybe around 5:30 or 6, and there were no other cars in the car park when I arrived. I had gotten to the bit before the final stair climb to the top. You pop up at the top of a small rise, and there's a bench to admire the view before you carry on. The next part is through a bit of bush, and then, from memory, you reach the steps. As I reached the bench, I felt the most terrifying feeling of dread come over me. It was instant, there was no warning whatsoever. It literally stopped me in my tracks. I stood dead still, scanned the track in front, and didn't see anything untoward. It was silent, and I could only hear my heart thumping. I stayed where I was for a few seconds, and the feeling didn't subside. It was horrifying. Not like anything I had ever felt before. I was frozen in fear, and I had no idea why. I turned around and started literally running and scrambling back down the way I came. I didn't stop for a single second until I reached the bottom. There were still no cars in the parking lot when I got back, and I just ducking floored it out of there. I have absolutely no idea what happened, and it was about 3 years ago, and I swear I will never set foot there again. I studied abroad in Sweden last year and decided to go on a hiking or camping trip for a week when I didn't have any classes. This was late September of last year. I'm an avid outdoorsman and do stuff like this often, so I wasn't worried about anything too much. I brushed up on the local flora and fauna in my area and set off for a lake close by. It was about a 30-minute bike ride from where I lived, and from there I was going to hike around the lake. I hiked about 8 to 10 miles a day and would set up camp. Everything was going as planned until the third night. I had set up camp in a lightly wooded area that was adjacent to the lake. It was a beautiful spot. I set up a hammock to sleep in, and as I was about to shut my eyes, I started to hear faint whistling. I decided that it was just the wind blowing through the trees above me. About 10 minutes later, I heard it again, but it was louder. I was in the middle of nowhere and hadn't seen a building, a person, or any sign of human activity since the day before. I wanted to shout out and see if someone was there, but instead decided to remain silent and keep listening. The whistling got louder, and I could hear footsteps crunching on branches, which sounded about 100 yards away. I was wondering if they could see my hammock hanging and if they were coming close, so I pulled out my hunting knife and laid there in silence. When I thought they were about 50 yards away, the footsteps stopped, and I could hear someone whispering something in Swedish. I can understand a few words when people speak Swedish, but it was too much for me to keep up with. I didn't hear anything the rest of the night. I just waited for the sun to rise. In the morning, I searched the area to see what I could find, and after an hour of looking, I couldn't find any evidence that someone had paid me a visit in the middle of the night. I decided the trip was over. I hiked straight towards the nearest road and hitchhiked back to the city before nightfall. I tried to remember what I'd heard so my Swedish friends could translate it, but I didn't pick any of it up. Pennsylvania. I camped out for the night along the Allegheny River. I got up to take a piss in the middle of the night. I got out of my tent and headed out a ways and up a little knoll. I finished my piss and then started back. I tripped and fell flat on my face. Almost face plant into a rock. But not a regular rock. Grave marker. Get up, see another grave marker, the one I tripped over. Look around. There are lots of grave markers. Probably 24 or so. Old ones. Like just a lump of stone with some carving in it. Not even the old white marble types. It just rocks with letters and numbers. I took a look. It's dark, maybe a John or something? Maybe Jane? Maybe 1739? Can't tell. Cool. And then everything got quiet. Silent. Hairs standing up on my neck and arms. It gets significantly cooler. Then I heard it. Go now. I don't know if it was an actual voice or if it was just my inner one, but I didn't wait for it to repeat. I hauled my ass back towards the campsite. Ran for what seemed like forever. I finally came out of the woods and onto the riverbank, just down the river, where I could see the last glow of our campfire, and I headed for it. Everyone else is asleep, and I convinced myself I just had a total wuss out scared of the dark moment. So, I calm down and go to sleep. In the morning, I retell the tale of finding the cemetery, leaving out the wuss reappearance, and me and a few other history buffs head out to find it. Now, this is a group of rednecks. Hunters, trappers, search and rescue team members, stuff like that. Finding my trail and tracking my movements was no big deal. We followed it all the way up to where I stopped. We could even see where it wandered around a bit, and then on the trail, it was obvious I had been just sprinting full tilt through the woods and brush. We didn't find a single stone. 6 guys are looking, canvassing the area. Guys that know how to do a search grid. Not 1 grave marker. None. A few years ago, my fiancé and I were staying at a remote primitive cabin, an old abandoned log home restored just enough so that backpackers could take shelter there. No electricity or cell service, no one else around. It was bitterly cold, with wee-cold snow on the ground. On the hike into the cabin, we passed an old mountain graveyard, just flat rocks upturned as gravestones among the trees, and my fiancé commented on the creepiness. That night we were settled inside when suddenly we heard someone walk slowly around the side of the cabin in the brittle ice and snow, steady crunching footsteps coming around to the door. We didn't even think to question what the sound was because it wasn't ambiguous at all, we just both knew for certain without speaking that there was someone at the door. Someone walked up to the door and didn't walk away. But when we shined a light and checked through the window, there wasn't anyone in front of the door. My fiancé is a US Marine and was armed, and he went into a mode I'd never seen before. He had me lock the door behind him, and he searched the whole area but found nothing. There were too many footprints in the snow and ice around the cabin, from us and previous visitors, for us to confirm what we heard. My fiancé and I completed the Appalachian Trail this year, so we had lots of time for weird stuff to happen in the woods. I forget where, but somewhere along the Appalachian Trail we came across a backpack and an entire outfit arranged anatomically beside the trail, as though someone had been lying down and then their body disappeared, leaving clothes, underwear, jackets, socks, and boots laid out in the shape of a person. It was a student backpack, jeans, and street clothes, not hiking gear or clothes. Who the heck takes the time to lay out abandoned clothes like that in the middle of absolutely nowhere? There were so many freaky accounts we heard from other thru hikers on the Appalachian Trail. Possibly my favorite was from one of our friends. He was camping with a group, 6 or 8 hikers in individual tents, in a remote area, and in the night they were all awoken by a woman screaming help. They all got up and checked on the female hikers in their group, and everyone was fine. I'd easily dismiss this as a standard mountain lion/bobcat story, except that when they compared notes regarding the direction of the screaming, everyone experienced the sound coming from the far side of the group of tents, from their own individual perspectives. So whatever was screaming was apparently standing right in the middle of all of their tents. One time, while camping in the Valley of Fire in Nevada with my wife and dog, we hiked in and set up our tent. We were pretty much alone. The other hike-in spots were far away, and maybe one was used. Sometime in the middle of the night, our dog, who was outside the tent, starts whining. He continues to get more agitated and begins to bark and growl very aggressively. Nervously, I unzip the tent and look out. In the distance, I could see what seemed like a brightly colored person or figure walking towards our tent. I grabbed my wife and made her look too to make sure I wasn't crazy. She also saw the figure. It came within a few hundred feet of our tent, the dog was still growling and whining, and then vanished. We both got out and looked around with our dog, calm now, but there was nothing around. Needless to say, we did not get much sleep the rest of the night. To this day, I cannot forget the image and have no idea what it was or where it went. It still bothers me that I don't know what it was. My ex-boyfriend and I did a rainforest walk, which dropped deep down to the bottom of the forest. There were no other cars in the parking lot, and I didn't come across any other hikers. We had it all to ourselves and had a great time making the most of it. As we were walking up, my ex was ahead of me and suddenly stopped, raising his hand to signal for me to stop with him. I looked up, and there was this woman standing up ahead of us, staring at us. She looked normal, but I got a chill as soon as I saw her. She had dark brown hair, which I only noticed because it contrasted so strongly against her cardigan. Her cardigan was all I could focus on. It went right down to her feet and was bleach white, totally clean, as if it had just been bought off the rack. I thought about how ridiculous it was to wear it while hiking. We stood there totally motionless, just staring back at her for what was probably only about 30 to 40 seconds but felt like a lifetime. We didn't feel immediately threatened, but there was no way I was going to take a step towards her. Instead, I felt this weird kind of stillness, as if the forest around us froze in time and went silent. She finally turned around and started to walk slowly back up the trail. We watched her and waited, not saying a word to each other, until she was well out of sight before we began walking. The car park was still around half an hour away, and we walked in silence, both a bit on edge and trying to listen for any suspicious sounds. I didn't see her or anyone else for the rest of the trail. There were still no cars in the parking lot when we returned. The absolute strangest experience I've ever had in the outdoors. I was hiking in Willamette National Forest on a trail I am very familiar with. I had my 2 dogs with me, a hound and a lab, and we had just gotten up a really steep hill, and I sat down for a rest. My dogs are usually just cruising around, sniffing out little critters, and enjoying themselves. Suddenly, one of my dogs starts growling and staring down the trail where we had just come from. Just like that, they both get right up next to me and growl, staring down the trail. It's not a particularly bushy area, so I can see pretty far and don't see anything, but the dogs were sure there was something there, and I believed them. Maybe a cougar? After a while, they calmed down, and we kept going and looped back on another trail. I had a pocket knife with me that I carried out for the next few miles, but we got back okay. They have never acted like that before or since. Last year, I was backpacking deep in the mountains in Montana. I was near Libby, Montana, about 3 hours west of Glacier National Park. I was hiking alone and expected to encounter bears, grizzlies, moose, etc. I'm experienced and know how to handle them, so I wasn't scared. But this time, I was way out in the middle of nowhere with nobody around for miles. Also, there was no cell service anywhere, and I did not have my emergency beacon with me. Usually, I expect to see other hikers on the trail, but not here. Nope. I was out there completely alone, and I knew it. Well, it was like 9 miles to my camp at Upper Cedar Lake. About halfway, the trail opened up, and I was in a somewhat clear area and had better visibility of what was around me. There were still trees and green undergrowth covering the ground. A few minutes later, I see something quickly scurry across the trail, maybe 50 feet in front of me. I stopped, froze, and waited. The creature noticed me and then stood up in the undergrowth, still almost completely covered by the tall grass and shrubs. It was about 3 feet tall, pitch black, 50 to 60 pounds, and obviously very quick and intelligent. I assumed it was a baby black bear at first, so I did not move or make any sound, and I got my bear spray ready, fully expecting an angry mama bear to come roaring out of the trees at me. But, thankfully, that did not happen, because I surely would have been attacked or at least bluff charged at. All I could see was its face through the tall grass. The creature stared at me invasively for about 30 seconds. I was staring back at it. It did not move a muscle. Then, suddenly, it huffed loudly at me and then ran through the grass up the side of the hill, and I never saw it again. The sound it made was a lot deeper than you would expect from something that small. It was like a bear's growl. You could almost feel it inside your chest. Very unsettling. I stood there silently and waited for another few minutes to see if Mama Bear was nearby, and that was indeed a cub, but nothing came. I gingerly passed through that area on the trail and kept hiking. My research tells me it may have been an otter or a mink, but I've seen them before, and this wasn't like any mammal I've seen before. It was the way it moved. I only saw it for a second, but it almost slithered on the ground like a reptile and then stood up on its hind legs and watched me, making me really uncomfortable. There was something sinister about it. I checked for tracks but couldn't find any. I have no idea what it was. Red River Gorge is a beautiful and huge park full of wildlife, rock climbing, waterfalls, dense forest, gorges, and beautiful views. This is a place that feels truly isolated and disconnected from the rest of the world. One fall evening, my boyfriend Dan and I decided to go camping at the gorge. We found a campground that was as backwoods as possible. Sites were spread far from each other. Our site was on the edge of a very steep drop-off. We arrived at sunset and quickly got to setting up camp. By the time we were fully set up, the sun had set, and we began to make a fire. About 20 minutes into relaxing by the fire, we began to hear howling that didn't sound too far away. We were both freaked out by the realization that there were wolves nearby, but we tried not to overreact and continued to sit by our fire. 10 minutes later, I started to hear a faint yelling about 15 feet away, past the cliff edge. I told Dan to be quiet and listen, and we both froze out of fear. A woman was screaming now. I couldn't make out any words at that point, but it was a deep guttural shriek, a noise that I have never heard a person make in real life. Then I heard it, she was screaming, "Help me somebody, please, oh my God. Someone please help me," and repeating this over and over, howling at the top of her lungs. I was terrified. She could have been turned around in the dark and fallen off the cliff, she could have been attacked by the wolves, a bear, or bitten by a snake. At this point, we both sprint to my car, frantically climb inside, and lock the doors. I tried calling the police, but I got no service. I threw the car in reverse and sped down the dirt road to find anyone who could help. The shrieks continued. I didn't make it far before coming across a group of 3 young men standing on the edge of the forest. I slowed down and cracked my window, still hearing the woman begging for help, and asked the men if they heard that. How could they not hear it? I told them I heard a woman crying for help in the forest, and 2 of them went sprinting into the darkness of the forest without questioning me any further. The other one just stood by my car, assuring me he had no idea what was happening. While the 2 men were somewhere in the forest, I drove farther down the dirt road until I found a spot to turn around. When I came back, the screaming had stopped, and the men were back by the side of the road. I slowed down and asked them where the woman was. No one answered. They looked a bit strange. I don't know. It didn't feel like they were anywhere close to being humans, but they looked human. This dread came up on me, so I just said okay. And drove away as quickly as possible. We left the campsite and went straight home. Once out of the woods, we called the local police station multiple times with no answer. I know it wasn't a child. I have never heard such primal, fearful screams in my life. It makes my skin crawl and my heart race just to think about it. What did those men get away with that night? What was I a witness to? Or is it imitating them or looking like them? To this day, I have found no answer. Maybe a year ago, I went down to my cabin near Victoria, Illinois. It was late fall and awfully chilly, but it was late at night, and I had just gotten my 4-wheeler, a 1986 Suzuki. Deep in the woods is a fishing and hunting community. I know these woods well. I have been hiking and riding in them since I was little, and I know them very well. Lots of old folks and a few people have died in those woods, but maybe I was being haunted. I was 17 at the time, and I and my family had just come down there from our home in the suburbs near Chicago. It was late at night, but I really, for some reason, had an extreme desire to go ride my 4-wheeler. I took a quick ride through the hunting trails, pitch black outside, but I have really bright headlights, so it was perfectly alright. I could see well, and I rode home, built a fire, and went out again. I was riding on one of the main dirt roads near our machine shed, where we keep tractors and such, and my 4-wheeler stalled. I got off of it and began making adjustments to the carburetor so I could make it run again. In the process, I shut the headlights off. As I made my adjustment, I heard a twig snap. I perked up but could barely see anything, so I kept working. Suddenly, I heard a deep, 2-tone whistle, maybe 100 feet from me. I looked in the direction it came from, but I could not see anything. I quickly made an adjustment and stood up. I heard an extremely fast footstep coming towards me, and the whistling again was only much closer, with the exact same tone, but maybe 10 to 15 feet towards me. I started my 4-wheeler, fully creeped out, and sped off towards a bunch of houses that had outside lights on. I turned around and saw nothing. I rode past the same spot at full speed to get back home. By the time I was home, my parents' fire that I had started was out, and they had gone to bed. I sat in our family room for maybe 5 to 6 hours, gun loaded, staring at the windows and door, when I heard a loud banging on the back porch multiple times very fast. I ran out the back door as fast as I could, flipped a light on the gun in hand, and saw nothing. I slowly went back into the house and sat and waited till I saw the sun peek over the horizon. At that point, I went to bed. I searched back then, and the only thing I could find was the myth of a spirit who killed ruthlessly but sought the company of those who dared ride horseback at night. I never experienced this again, but I'm always on edge nowadays when I'm out there. One day, my husband and I were doing a day hike in the Sam Houston National Forest north of Houston. As usual, we got out there too late for the hike I had planned. I think we were doing some kind of loop that joined up with the Lone Star Trail at some point. We got caught in the dark but had headlamps, and the trail is well marked, so I wasn't worried. My husband starts shining his light into the forest on our right side to be curious. We always hear a lot of animal calls around dark up there, which I'm pretty sure are deer. So when he shines his light over us, we see the reflection of some eyes. They look round and orange in color. The first time they were pretty high up, like maybe in a tree, but a second time we saw them again, or maybe they belonged to a second animal? Lower down, but still close as if following us. To this day, I wonder what it could have been. What animal follows you at night? There are mostly deer there, but maybe there could have been raccoons? I know they are curious animals. We didn't hear any sounds that I remember. Me and 4 of my buddies went on a 2-day hunt on a reserve. On day 1, about 8:30 in the morning, about 500 yards from my spot, my buddy filmed a fat black bear. We only had muzzle loaders. They are like a Civil War style gun. You get one shot, then you have to reload with the ramrod and stuff. I never saw any deer, so at 2 p.m., after lunch, me and another buddy scouted for a new spot. We find a huge animal trail, and he drops me off. I tell him to pick me up, I'll be on the road after dark. He's about 7 miles away. I sit there from 2 p.m. until dark, and all I see are loads of elk. The trail wasn't deer, it was an elk highway. So it gets dark, and I creep down the road. Right at dusk, it was almost too dark to see something crash in the thick bushes about 30 yards in front of me across the road. I think, maybe it's a deer. So I grunted and called just to get a reaction. Nothing. So I creep on it, thinking I can bust it if it's a deer. It doesn't budge, he just sniffs like a dog. Sniff, sniff, sniff. I kick the ground and stomp, trying to bump it. It just keeps sniffing. I remember that bear, and I'm 10 feet from whatever this is. I slowly back into a feed plot behind me with my one shot at my hip. I'm going to have to hip shoot it if it's a bear. I get 50 yards in the middle of a field plot, a big bull elk off to my right in the full moonlight. I see something drive out of the bushes into the thicket across the road to my left, so I run further out. It's a standoff. I shine my light into the thicket, and I see eyes reflecting back. They look 8 inches apart, 4 feet off the ground, just sniffing over and over. I'm like, where's my brother? It's full dark, and this thing is stalking me using cover. My buddy lights start shinning down the road, and this thing crashes through the bushes away. I figure it's a bear, but I don't know. I was turtle heading, I'm not going to lie. I had one shot in the dark. Coyotes howl like crazy too. Predators were out in full effect on the full moon night. I live fairly remotely in New Hampshire, at the edge of the Great North Woods, and there are forests surrounding my house. I spent most of my childhood growing up in the woods and never had an issue exploring, either on foot or on horseback, and for the most part, I've had a good understanding and healthy respect of the animals that live in the woods out here. I don't know when I started noticing, but over the years I picked up on the fact that some nights throughout the year the woods feel unwelcoming. I don't know how to describe it other than that I shouldn't be out there, and it feels like the woods have become an entirely different place than they usually are. One of the things that I've noticed most prevalently during the unwelcoming nights is that wildlife seems to disappear or act differently. For example, there have always been coyotes where I live, and I could always hear them howling all year round, except during those nights. I've also noticed that the wild ducks who typically live at the pond in my house will disappear the day before one of the unwelcoming nights. It seems to me like it's similar to advice I've heard before: if you don't hear any birds or animals in the woods, there is a reason for them to be quiet. Years ago, I had an experience with what I believe to be a not deer in the area, so I have experience with weird things, and I know there are weird things going on in the area, as it's typical for the Appalachians. And the feeling that I get on unwelcoming nights in the woods is similar to the eerie feeling that I've had when experiencing cryptid or paranormal things in the past. At around 8 to 10 years old, I was at a lake way out in the woods on some land my dad owned. I was alone aside from my dog, an Airedale Terrier. I had only been fishing on the little pier in the southeast corner for about 10 minutes when I got an almost overwhelming feeling of being in danger and then noticed something or someone watching me from the tree line on the other side of the lake. I was a kid, but I somehow kept my composure. For some reason, I felt it was important that, whatever or whoever it was, I was aware. Anyway, it started moving slowly from tree to tree, never taking its eyes off of me. The lake was about 75 yards wide, so I couldn't see any details, but I could tell which way the figure was facing. After realizing that it was stalking me, I nonchalantly put my pole down and walked down the pier and up the bank towards the trail back to our cabin, which was about a quarter mile away. Once I hit the tree line, I hauled my ass to the cabin and waited there with one of my dad's guns until my parents got home. The only witness I had was my dog, and he saw it as well. I know because he was staring intently at the figure while giving a low growl until I quietly told him to stop. I have no idea who or what it could have been, but I know its intentions were most definitely not good. This took place in southeast Mississippi, near the Alabama border, back in the early 90s. We didn't live there, our home was in Mobile, Alabama, but we spent most weekends up there. I know it could have been a person, but the nearest neighbor was a very old couple that lived a few miles away. The closest paved road was a good 15 to 20 minute drive away from our land. Aside from the lake and the open area our cabin was in, the surrounding area was all really thick forest. The figure was extremely tall as well. I have an extremely good memory, especially for details. Also, shortly before I actually noticed it, I got a very strong "I'm being watched by something dangerous" feeling. I never felt safe there again, and I was glad when my dad sold it and got a place near Gulf Shores. Anyway, I wish I could have seen more details, or maybe not. I went rockhounding solo today to a place my husband and I have been before. Everything seemed normal when I arrived. It's a very secluded area of the creek, with a rock bar in the middle of the creek, a small patch of wood to the left, and a dense forest on the right. I crossed the creek and set up my gear on the rock bar, grabbed a bag, and started walking up the creek. About 45 minutes in, I kept looking up at the forest. I don't know why, but I just kept getting an eerie feeling. Every now and again I'd hear a couple of thumps out there, but, nature, so I didn't think anything of it. About an hour later, I heard my first meow. I was so focused on pulling clay that I literally stood up and was like, I did not just hear a cat meow, did I? 10 minutes go by and I'm walking further up the creek, and damn if I didn't hear it again. I stopped and was like, yep, I just heard a cat meow. How strange. But, something seemed really off, and I started to feel uneasy, so I turned around and headed back to my site. Something about the meow wasn't right. It wasn't a painful meow, but just like a matter-of-fact meow, if that makes sense. About 5 minutes into the trek back, I definitely hear a meow, and I'm sweating like crazy because of the heat, but I instantly feel cold and clammy, and the hair is standing up on the back of my neck. I know what I was supposed to be hearing, a single meow, but it wasn't coming from a cat. It sounded like someone or something imitating a meow. I keep focused on getting back to my site, and about 5 minutes later, another single meow. Here's where I realize things are getting really weird. The meow always sounded the same distance from me, no matter how far I kept walking. I finally reach my site, pull out my drinks, and plop down to rehydrate. That's when another meow sounded, and this time I knew with everything in me that that was not a cat following me. I calmly gathered up my gear and started to trek across the creek to the path to my car. And another meow. I made my way across the creek and hunched down in a pit. I parked my car right next to the edge of the forest and was really starting to lose my shit. I get my keys and mace out and put my gear on me so I can dive into my car and rearrange later. And that's exactly what I did. I nearly shit myself finding the courage to make it to my car, but I did, and I hightailed it out of there fast. The rational answer is that someone was screwing with me, but how did they get back there? It's like 200 acres of forest. I have lived in my house my whole life with my 2 other siblings and parents. My family and I have lived in this partly rural part of the Fenton/Heartland, Michigan, area for a long time. We own 10 acres of land, which includes a pretty large track in our backyard to ride 4-wheelers and such. Every once in a great while, it seems, we hear strange and unnerving noises when we go outside. A few years ago, my family took a walk to look at our new neighbor's house as they were gone for the weekend and said we were welcome to check things out. On our way down our quarter-mile gravel driveway, all of us heard what I can only describe as drums and chanting. It really freaked my brother and I out because it seemed to be a fair distance away, almost as if it had been coming from the woods in our backyard. There were a fair number of drumming sounds, and then we heard chanting. It must have been pretty far away, but the sound still carried, which made it even creepier. I've probably had this occur 2 to 3 times the whole time we've lived here, and every time it has been unsettling and felt really wrong. We would be very aware if our town had any native tribes or reservations around here, but my small, conservative hometown would not be the place to do so. I have searched high and low, but I haven't been able to find anything on the internet in close areas with a similar experience. On the border of the park is West Mountain, a somewhat smallish ski mountain. The story of Abigail West, Mount's namesake, is actually well documented. She was in her 40s, living on the mountain in the 1700s. Abigail was struck by lightning and crawled a couple miles for help before dying. Her house shortly burned down afterwards, leaving only a chimney still visible to this day. Some say if you're in a thunderstorm and stumble upon it, there might be a fire for you, or Abigail might just chase you off her land. I spent a lot of time skiing and hiking up there and have heard some pretty crazy things in the night. My buddies and I in high school climbed the backside and bushwhacked, planning to overnight on top to get to our car on the front side the next day. We were just about done setting up camp when we heard a blood-curdling scream, followed quickly by a slight rain, then a precipitous downpour with lightning and booming thunder. We could have easily rode out the 20-minute storm, but it was so unnerving that we hightailed out of there real quick. In hindsight, it could have been a fisherman's scream, but to this day, almost 2 decades later, I still can hear it. This happened about 18 months ago. It was a remote area, though not particularly desolate, which means it does get many hikers in the summer and autumn months, but back then it was totally deserted due to the extreme cold and heavy snowfall. I was looking around myself every now and then, and after walking for about 2 or 2.5 hours, I could see someone far behind me. I'm 100% sure it wasn't someone taking a break, because there are no tracks ahead of me, and I should have noticed if I passed them by. The person seemed to keep their distance. I stopped after a while to see if they would catch up to me, and it seemed they picked up pace for a few minutes but then stopped. When I resumed walking, so did they. I decided to keep hiking as if nothing was out of the ordinary, but after about an hour, they disappeared. I didn't look behind me for like 10 or 15 minutes, and when I turned again, they were gone. The trail elevation varies a lot, and there are several bends, but I never saw them again for the rest of the hike. My best explanation is that the person grew tired. It's very hard and exhausting to hike in deep snow if you're not a very fit person, and either turned back or slowed way down. But the most confusing part is, where the hell did they come from? They weren't always behind me, and they didn't seem fast enough to have started the hike long after myself and then caught up to me. Maybe they were in the woods and then found the trail again? I really am unsure what to make of this. I was doing a night hike, and I started to see the glow of a fire. It is too big to be a campfire but too small to be a wildfire. I went to check it out, and all of a sudden I saw a bunch of people in tuxedos while wearing masks. They all had torches, and they circled around a big cross with someone strapped to it. I walked into a cultural sacrifice. I hid in the trees. A fat man spoke to the crowd for a good 20 minutes. The man strapped to the cross was alive but looked to have been drugged. As I started quietly making my way back to camp, I stepped on a branch, and I heard one person say, "We're being watched. Find the person for a second sacrifice." I'm a bigger guy, but the way I ran off, I could have been a gold medalist. I never looked back. I finally made it to the camp, packed my stuff, and got out of there. Nothing ever happened to me, and there was nothing in the news about a sacrifice. I used to love hiking alone. Getting away from responsibilities, societal pressures, and mankind itself being one with the forest. It's euphoric, really. Nothing can describe the joy of being alone in the sunny woods. That's exactly why, after my 9-to-5 day job at my office, I used to always go down to this little hiking trail. It's convenient, too, being only a few miles from my condo. Down the road from the waffle spot, right by the odd little statue, I always think of the statue as a landmark, especially as a person who gets lost quite easily. Those lanky arms could be seen from a mile away. Funny, right? A few months ago, I was feeling especially down. My boss had just asked me to work over the weekend for the third time in a row, so of course I'd be a tad pissed. I decided it would be best to let off steam with a good hike. I drove down the winding avenue, passing rows of little brick shops all in a row. The street grows a bit sparser, and the buildings look a little older and less maintained. Neatly paved roads start to appear grayer and dappled with cracks. I drive by the bustling waffle spot. There it was. The oddly abstract figure stood there, arms high in the air. The statue I had familiarized myself with. I took a turn into the gravel lot and parked my old Corolla, sliding on my boots and buttoning up my trusty coat. I open the door and step outside, ducking underneath the wooden sign with Westward Trail painted in big, yellow letters. I hike across the trail, stepping over oh-so-familiar footholds and roots, picking up anything interesting I find along the way. Bottle caps. Safety pins. Sugar maple leaves are slightly more colorful than the rest. I make my way over peaceful creeks and ivy bushes, around patches of chicoberry and ferns. For once, I feel free. But something didn't feel right. The woods were oddly quiet today, no birds sang, no crickets chirped. It seemed the only one making noise was me. Until I heard it. The pitter-patter of footsteps in the leaves. My heart drops, not from the noise itself but from the colliding atmospheres. Something is wrong, really wrong. I felt it in my gut. I slowly turn around to see. A squirrel. I nearly fainted because of a squirrel. It scampered off into the bushes, as if it were in flight from something. Probably me. It stirred up leaves with its tiny clawed feet as it weaved between the trees, disappearing into the distance. I chuckle. Of course, a fuzzy squirrel wasn't going to faze me. I hiked some more. Scaling mossy boulders and jumping over fallen trees. The sun began to creep slowly towards the horizon as the blue skies turned a pleasant pink. It was about 7 o'clock, it was time to head back. I retract my steps, up the same hills, through the same trees. I find myself standing in front of that old, wooden sign. If only I had known what awaited me there. I step into the gravel parking lot, and a chill runs down my spine. I'd like to say that I turned around and realized what I had encountered, but it was too fast. The thing's long, bone-thing arms took hold of me with an iron grip, the clammy hands digging into my flesh. I feel myself being lifted off the ground, the gravel dissipating beneath my feet. I was being hoisted, it seemed, until I reached a height at which no person could lift a fully grown adult. I wasn't going without a fight. I screamed, kicked, and thrashed about like a fish caught in a net. I run. I make a mad break for the car. I lock the doors and hightail out of there, my foot pressing so hard on the gas it hurt. I drove without stopping or looking back. My heart raced in an uneven yet incredibly quick rhythm, my eyes flicking about anxiously. I see the lights of the waffle spot fade away behind me as I get closer to the sweet safety of my condominium. I rush inside, not bothering to take off my coat, lock the doors, and nestle up in the corner behind my bed. I stayed in that very spot until the sun rose. I tried telling the police, they investigated the scene, but no evidence turned up. Not like paranormal entities have fingerprints, after all. I still hike alone sometimes, but I usually like to bring a friend or two. Or three. Honestly, any amount is fine with me. Sometimes I drive by that trail, and it's mostly the same. Wooden sign, gravel lot, messy grass, there's only one difference. The statue's not there anymore. My best friend and I went camping up at some high lakes in southern Oregon back when I was in college. We grew up there and had been to these lakes a few times in the past. This time we went in the early spring when there was still snow at the trailhead. We made camp at our favorite lake and found it frozen over. We checked out some ice fishing holes, made camp, explored, and did normal activities for the first day of camp. That night, we both woke up to a bright light shining into our tent. It was the full moon reflecting off the lake, and it lit up the whole basin we were in. So naturally, we played night soccer on the frozen lake with an old pot. One of us kicked the pot across the lake, and it slid into this indentation in the ice. We ran over to get the pot and resume our game and found that this indentation was in the shape of a foot but larger. After looking around, we found a trail of these large footprints. They were in the same pattern as normal human gait, but larger and spaced out much further as well. We had to jump to follow the pattern. They arced across the southeast section of the lake. At first we thought it could be from a snowshoer, and as the snow melted and refroze, it made these large indentations, but that didn't explain the distance between the prints. I don't believe in Bigfoot, but to this day, I have no idea what could have made those tracks. Solo backpacking 2-night trip in SW, Missouri. First night. All night I hear a pack of coyotes yipping far off. I go to bed in my hammock around 9 p.m. I woke at 1 a.m., and the coyote was barking much closer, very loud but not next to me. Go back to sleep. 3 a.m., dead silent. I have to go pee. Get up and walk to the tree. Silence. I didn't have my headlamp on since the moon was bright. I hear rustling in the leaves behind me. I switch on my headlamp, and to my right is about the same distance between me and my hammock. Maybe 10 yards. I see the eye glow of 6 coyotes bobbing up and down. I yell, and they stop and fixate on me. I start kicking my feet, and my shoe, not tied, flies off towards them. They look at my shoe and back off. Now I try to walk back to my hammock, but rocks and sticks slow me down. I get back to camp and see that they are the same distance away but have now moved around between me and the fire circle. I grab a hiking pole and golf swing and hit my pot, and that finally scares them off in all directions. I did manage to go back to sleep when the sun just started to come up. Longest wait for a sunrise in my life. I still go to that spot every few years. I went camping in New Mexico almost 3 years ago. Decided to set up at the end of an off-road and also at the base of a trailhead. We were about 10 miles into the mountains and 30 minutes outside of the nearest town. I woke up to headlights shining on our tents. A car was parked and pointed at us through about a 15-foot stretch of trees. They kept the lights on for about 20 minutes, then began to flash them on and off. The boys decided to go ask if they needed something. My friend takes about 3 steps out of the tent, and a gun fires. We yelled out his name and asked if he was okay. He said nothing. We thought he was dead. Strangers ended up shooting right above our campsite for the next 20 minutes. I crawled partially out of our tent and realized that the strangers could see and hear us perfectly, but we couldn't see them. I also saw that our friend was crouched behind our car. That's why our friend wasn't making any noise. He was afraid to call attention to himself. We eventually all ran out of our tents and hid behind the car, which was facing them, and just waited them out. The whole ordeal lasted about an hour but felt like an eternity. We basically packed our campsite and made the 5-hour journey back home in the middle of the night after that. I went to high school in a small Minnesota town, mostly farmland intersected by wooded areas and, of course, dozens of small lakes. One side of my neighborhood was bordered by a relatively large marshland that you could access via a slope that wound down to a trail. This trail curved through the marsh into a big patch of woods about 3/4 of a mile away. In the fall or spring, after heavy rains, fog would often settle over the marsh as it was so much lower than the surrounding area, and it truly looked like something out of a Stephen King novel. After one of these rains, my brother and I, he was probably 13 and I was 16, decided it would be a great idea to go explore the woods in the fog. Although the sun was setting fast, we knew that we could make it to the woods in about 10 minutes if we left immediately. We grabbed a couple of flashlights, knowing that it would be dark by the time we got home, and headed for the trail. Once we were on the trail and moving, it hit us just how thick this fog was. We had only been walking for a minute or two, but we had absolutely no visibility behind us and 5 to 10 feet max in front of us. We continued walking for a few more minutes, bullshitting about hearing noises and seeing red eyes in the distance the whole time, until we came to a curve in the trail. This curve signaled that we were only about 100 yards from the entrance to the woods. At this point, there is a small lake on the left side of the trail and miles of marshland on the right. It's important to note that we have moved farther and farther away from any houses. Our house was the closest to the trail, and the trail moved away from our neighborhood rather than bordering any backyards. We began walking past the lake, and then we heard a splash. It was definitely larger than a fish jumping, but we had no idea what else would have made that noise. We stopped, waited, and, upon hearing nothing else, continued on our way. We couldn't have been going for more than 15 seconds when we heard cracking and shuffling in the brush up ahead to our left. We stopped dead in our tracks and waited. At the end of our eyesight, which could have only been about 10 feet, a figure stepped out from the brush bordering the lake. The fog was too thick to make out many details, but it must have been at least 6'4" and very broad-shouldered. As the figure made its way into the middle of the trail, my brother gasped, and it stopped. Its head shot over, looked right at us, and just stared. It felt like an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. I felt true terror at that moment, and I've never replicated that feeling. I began to take a small step backwards, and suddenly the figure took off running into the marshland. Again, there were no houses, buildings, or anything for miles in the direction that it ran. Suffice it to say, my brother and I sprinted back to the house faster than I have ever run. I still don't know what or who I saw that day. I hope I never do. I remember camping at a lean-to somewhere along the Northville Placid Trail one summer with my dad and his friend. We had a great afternoon exploring the area, and after it got dark, we let the fire go out and called it a night. We had been in our tents for almost an hour when we could make out some sounds like brush breaking. It gets louder and louder until we're sure someone is out there. My dad's friend opens his tent and calls out, asking who's there. The reply back was simply, "It's Richard." We come out of our tents with our headlamps on and see a solitary figure come walking out of the darkness into our campsite. He drops his pack on the edge of the lean-to, and we see he's holding a hatchet, and he's got a serious black eye. We make some awkward small talk, try to ask him why he was hiking alone in the pitch dark, what happened to his eye, etc. He sets up his sleeping bag and gets himself situated right next to our tent in the lean-to. My dad and I spent a very restless night next to him before we packed it up in the morning and shipped it out as Richard watched us from his sleeping bag. Minnesota Valley State Recreation Area, early 2000s. My wife and I were a bit new to camping together, and during our travels through the state, we found this state campground just west of Shakopee. We got there before sunset and snagged a campsite. We thought it was unusual that we were the only people at this campground, which was only accessible via a 5-mile gravel road from the main highway, but we saw a park ranger driving through when we arrived, so we felt like everything was okay. We unloaded some of our gear, a tent, tarp, and buckets of supplies, just to reserve our spot and headed back into town for a quick dinner. This was before we got skilled at cooking at our campsites. Dinner took longer than we expected, and we knew that we had to get back to our campground before the gates closed at 10 p.m. We made it back with about 15 minutes to spare and started setting everything up. Not long after we got the air mattresses and sleeping bags inside the tent, we started hearing the crunching of leaves in the darkness just beyond the campsite, like heavy footsteps. It went from one side of the site to the other for a few minutes and seemed to follow wherever we went as we set up the site. Suddenly, that was followed by a very loud, deep, unnaturally gravelly, and raspy moan that chilled us to the bones. It didn't take long before my wife and I started feeling unnerved by the noises. Curious about what it might be, I took a flashlight and shined it into the woods in the direction of the noise, just to relieve my nerves and make sure there was nothing to fear. However, almost immediately after shining the light into the dark mass of trees, the light reflected off of two eyes at the height of another human several feet away. I felt the blood rush from me as an almost paralyzing terror took over. Even thinking about it now still gives me chills. I told my wife what I saw, and she declared in no uncertain terms that it was time for us to go. By now, it was already after 10 p.m., and the campground gates were supposed to be closed. We hadn't seen the park ranger since we returned from dinner, but we didn't care. We threw all of our valuables back into the car along with whatever we could quickly grab and took off towards the entrance, leaving our tent, sleeping bags, and most of our gear behind. We were relieved to see that the gates were still wide open, as if the entire area had been completely untouched, and we sped off back down the gravel road to the highway. About 1.5 miles down the dark gravel road, one of our tires blew. We had the choice to stop and try to put on the spare in our pitch-black surroundings, or we could risk driving on it and possibly doing further damage to our car until we could get back to civilization. With a creeping sense of dread following us from whatever was with us at our campsite, we pressed on. Eventually, we made it to a gas station off the highway, where a very kind couple offered to help us change the tire and accompany us back to camp to get the rest of our stuff, but we instead thanked them for their generosity and kindness and found a cheap motel room in Shakopee for the night. The next morning, we went back, and everything was significantly less scary in the daytime. We gathered and packed up all of our stuff that had been there since the night before, and we felt much relief. We didn't know what it was that we heard or saw. A bear? Some kind of spirit? The Wendigo? Or maybe our minds were just playing tricks on us. We never forgot about it, though, and we always think about it when we go camping now in a dark, remote, isolated area by ourselves. One time I was backpacking alone through a local state forest, and I had accidentally wandered off the trail when a freak storm rolled in and forced me to hastily set up camp. It took me less than 10 minutes to set up, and by the time I had finished, the rain was beginning to pour. It was later in the day when this happened, I think around 4:30 to 5:30-ish, so I decided to just eat something light and get some sleep. I was woken up periodically, not only by the thunderclaps but also by what I assumed were animal footsteps through the night. At one point, the footsteps were so close that I decided to peek out and see if I could catch a glimpse of any eyes reflecting back with my red flashlight, but when I opened my tent, it was silent except for the waning sound of the storm. Being a break in the rain on a dark, stormy night, I decided it was now or never to do my business. It remained eerily quiet the whole time, and after I was done, I rushed back and hoped into my sleeping bag to go back to sleep. Later on in the night, I was once again awoken, but not by the sounds of some nocturnal animal, but what I swore sounded like faint voices. This honestly came as a relief to me because I thought that meant that I was near another person's camp and wasn't completely lost. In the morning, after the rain had subsided, I packed up and decided to check where I thought I had headed. Much to my surprise, I had to walk up a pretty steep incline, and still there was no camp or trail in sight, and no remnants or any signs there were ever any there. Walking forward a bit farther, I saw an old rotten fence and a sign on the other side designating the area in which I had accidentally just slept as an old abandoned pioneer graveyard. And sure enough, when I went back through, I found a few gravestones I had overlooked before. It was weird that it was literally in the middle of the forest, but I was just happy that this meant I could find my way back to the trail. It was definitely a weird experience. I've gone back through that area several times over the years and never experienced anything else since. I will never walk through the woods at night again. For starters, as you all know, it was New Year's Eve, and most people like to have their fair share of drinks at that time. My friend hosted a party that was 2 kilometers, 1.25 miles, away from my house if I took the road, which is pitch black, for about 1.5 kilometers of the total distance. However, I can also take the other road, which would have totaled in about 7 kilometers around a lake, search Harku Lake Estonia and it should show up, which goes through the city I live near. The road through there is well lit all the way. As you would imagine, I won't be taking a triple distance at night when I am a bit tipsy, so I split from the party at about 3:10 a.m. and decided to take the short walk through the woods. I was walking through the forest with the only light source being my phone flashlight and the dots of the city street lights glimmering far over the lake. At one point, when starting the hike, I opened the camera app on my phone to snap a few photos for fun, uploading them between me and a friend and describing my little journey. He was making sure I got home safely. About halfway down the road, at the farthest point from the houses and lit places around, I hear rustling about 20 to 40 meters away from me. I stop walking to listen. I hear some things, coming towards me at a slow pace, with the snow crunching under their heavy steps and branches crackling. I call out, "Hey!" Through the night. The steps stopped, nothing but dead silence for what seemed like forever. I thought I just might be hearing things, taking into account that I did have a few beers and 2 or 3 shots of vodka. I take another picture from my phone, as the flash of the camera lights up a small part of the trees for a split second, and I feel my feet sink into the ground as panic freezes my entire body. I was not alone, and there was something between the trees, now 20 to 30 meters away, staring back at me. Suddenly, the steps start again. I snap out of my fear and book it, hearing the steps behind me grow faster and finally fading behind, running down the road as fast as I have ever run, not looking back. As I finally see the street lights, like the light at the end of the tunnel, I finally reach the lit part of the road. I turn around to look back. No one, nothing. A few cars drive by as I walk the final few hundred meters, being as alert as I have ever been. I reach my house. I open my front door and lock it. I feel relieved and safe. I walk to my toilet and take the meanest dump I have ever had. Partially from the consumed alcohol and partially from the fear. I scroll through the photos on my phone that I took when something catches my eye. 2 pairs of eyes are looking at me. Cold fear overcomes my body again. Those were probably just some deer or wild boars stumbling around, but that is not what scares me. The feeling of being alone, intoxicated, and unaware in the dark at your most vulnerable. You know nothing about what stares back at you from the dark, having vision for only 10 feet around you. 2 pairs of eyes are staring back at you from the abyss of the night. I was out camping with some friends on a remote beach, and I stayed up later than them, as usual, and was poking the fire and listening to the wolves howling. Since there was no way I'd get much sleep with the damn wolves making so much noise, I decided to try to find them, put the fire out, grab a light, and hit the woods. I know, this sounds like a setting for so many horror movies. After a few hours of unsuccessful wolf stalking, I come to a deep river and decide to turn back. As I got about halfway to the campsite, my flashlight died, but luckily the moon was full and the moonlight was enough. As I reached the campsite, I noticed a large, dark shape near the tree line by the tents. I drew my knife and silently went in closer. It was larger than any bear or elk I had ever seen, and I couldn't quite make out what it was, and it didn't make any noise. I watched as it moved along the beach and into our campsite, then in between our 3 tents, and disappeared soundlessly into the trees. I looked around for footprints, but all I could see were deep, unrecognizable indentations in the sand. To this day, I have no idea what it could have been. I slept with my knife and axe that night. And I bought a better flashlight.